Hello, today we have with us Kalsoom Lakhani, the founder of I2I Ventures, and today we will explore what it takes to build an entrepreneurial ecosystem in frontier markets like Pakistan. Starting with Kalsoom, thank you so much for coming on Leading with Women.
Thanks for having me.
So tell us, what value do you see in investing in frontier markets like Cambodia, Pakistan, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, etc.? Do international investors need a shift in mindset to unlock their potential?
I think investors, they do need a shift in mindset. So I think a lot of investors tend to be very, as much as like venture capital is a very pro risk asset class, I think a lot of investors, when it's markets that they don't understand, they obviously tend to be pretty risk averse to it. So markets like Pakistan, it's taken a lot of people time to get used to the idea around it, even though the macro indicators are something that people feel very excited about. And so yeah, I do think it takes a bit beyond a shift in mindset. I think it just takes a sense of courage, to be honest. I think a lot of investors in emerging markets tend to operate with a herd mentality. And when you're investing in a new market, it requires you to kind of have the courage to be one of the first people deciding to do something. And obviously, it's not investing without any source of foundation of why you're not doing it in the market, but it does take a little bit of that initial bravery to kind of take the jump and be in a new market for the first time.
So once you've taken the jump, what are a few heuristics that you would recommend when making sense of venture capital in Pakistan or other emerging economies?
Sure. So, I mean, I think for the very first thing you should be looking at are the macro indicators, right? So, how large is the market that you're looking at? Like, what is the addressable market? For instance, Pakistan is the fifth largest market in the world. Our addressable market is actually growing in size, mainly because we have a very big youth population, 100 million broadband subscribers, smartphone penetration is increasing. We're going to have one of the third largest middle class in a few years behind India and China. So when you look at those indicators, the second thing that I would actually suggest doing is start speaking to people in the market, right? So people that you've identified are considered thought leaders or people that are pioneers in pushing things in those startup ecosystems. And so I think one of the biggest mistakes you can make is just make a lot of assumptions and just go in blind. But I think you have to kind of for yourself identify people that you really trust their perspective on things. And I know that I'm this for a lot of people looking at Pakistan, where people will just send me deals and ask my perspective on it, because so many of these emerging markets are so relational that oftentimes like you can get more of a deeper sense of what's going on there, as well as like, you know, the story or the relationships behind a certain company by speaking to someone that you trust on the ground. So that would be my top two things.
Okay, but what goes into building an entrepreneurial ecosystem? What are the steps that are involved?
Sure. So it's complex, right? An ecosystem by nature is, a complex set of factors that are all working together and are very intersectional. So you're not going to build an overnight entrepreneurship ecosystem. I started working in Pakistan a decade ago, and even places like Bangladesh, where I've done work with other players on the ground. It's still very much developing, and so a startup ecosystem, you first have to kind of understand first the health of the ecosystem. So where does it stand now? So if we're looking at a startup ecosystem, the typical pillars of an ecosystem are what role government currently plays, what does the investor landscape look like, where are startups originating from, how many companies are there, what does the support landscape look like, how many incubators, accelerators, co-working spaces. So I think the first thing to do is to actually start to qualify and quantify the health of that ecosystem, and then that gives you a sense of where the startup ecosystem stands, and then you can build from there. But I think it's really kind of a weird thing to come in and say I want to build a startup ecosystem, because there's just so many levers that are there that are in place. So it's more important to say, like, where is it that I can provide value, and is there room for that? What is the current health of that pillar of that startup ecosystem? And also keeping in mind that they all kind of play off one another. So that would be what I would say.
So it's been almost a decade since we established an accelerator in Pakistan. How have the roles or the needs of accelerators evolved since then?
Yeah. So, I mean, when we started our startup accelerator in Pakistan, it was 10 years ago. So, we were the first, one of the first startup support, like the major private ones in the country that started in 2012. And it was a very small program. It was probably a little premature for where the market was. Most entrepreneurs and companies were quite early on, and maybe sometimes too early for a startup accelerator. I would say overall, the startup ecosystem has overall matured. So there's just a lot more entrepreneurs, a lot more founders. The Pakistan government has set up these public-private partnerships called the National Incubation Centers all over the country. So generally, we're just seeing an overall increase in volume of companies as well as an increase in the quality of pipeline. So as a result of that, accelerators are, that actually then starts to qualify how accelerators behave. We're still one of the very few accelerators in the country. So I would say our pipeline overall has improved significantly, as well as the offering of the program has improved because we actually adapt accordingly to what the market needs. And as more entrepreneurs are coming up, as well as their, the quality of them improving, that's how the accelerator, at least on from Invest to Innovate side, which is separate from our fund, that's how it has also improved over time and iterated.
So, what are some driving force behind, as you said, it in evolving and maturing?
I mean, there's so many things that need to happen. Again, like it's not just one, an ecosystem does not evolve linearly. So I think a few things that have happened is, as I mentioned, the Pakistan government, both provincially, so in Punjab, was very much a big part of why the Lahori startup ecosystem developed first. So we saw that happen with, the Punjab Information Technology Board launching incubators like Plan 9 and then the accelerator Plan X. We saw that the Pakistan government, the federal government, put funding behind launching national incubation centers. But then beyond that, I think one of the most pivotal things that have happened in the last year and a half really has been the regulatory environment has shifted positively for the startup ecosystem. And so that would have been one of the big ceilings that I would say was in place in terms of holding the Pakistani startup ecosystem really back in terms of the potential for growth. And so there's been some new regulations that have happened because people in power are quite progressive in listening to stakeholders like ourselves in terms of putting in the changes to actually allow for, as an example, a founder in Pakistan to hold equity in a holding company abroad, which makes it easier to raise funding. And so there's so many things that need to happen. And then as the macro indicators were improving, as the Careem mafia, which is what Careem, which is the Uber competitor that was actually acquired by Uber in the Middle East, had a lot of Pakistanis that worked for it. Careem Islamabad was actually one of the best performing offices there. A lot of Korean people left and started companies in Pakistan, right? So that as better founders were also starting companies, that was also attracting a lot of capital. And then we were also seeing with COVID happen in the pandemic, we were seeing it actually push digitization forward, which wasn't happening before. So there's just, again, like it's such a complex thing, but you need to have so many things happening at the same time. And especially from the regulatory perspective, the fintech sector in Pakistan was being held back considerably. It's why we weren't seeing a lot of fintech innovation over the last, decade. And really in the last year, we've seen fintech companies generally in terms of quantum of deals raise a lot of money in the startup ecosystem, thanks to regulatory changes, as well as talent, as well as more as a result attracting more international investor attention, all of those things, and then also more local funds that are coming up too. So again, very complex question, but there is a lot of things, especially from the Pakistan's perspective, that was happening kind of at the same time that allowed for the ecosystem to really develop.
Okay. Talking about funding and talking about venture capital, you had a recent tweet which said that your master's in conflict resolution has proven to be more valuable than an MBA degree when doing investor investigations. Could you please elaborate?
It's not investor investigation. I talked about negotiation. Yeah, I
Negotiations,
mean,
okay?
yeah. So conflict resolution is, I did my master's in foreign affairs. I did my undergraduate degree in politics and foreign policy. When I started to when I did my graduate degree, I originally thought that I would be applying it to conflicts in the world in terms of thinking about how we adapted and thought about resolution. But ultimately, the fundamental tactics under conflict resolution is number one, it's very relational, right? So when you're in a negotiation with someone, it's less about being transactional and not being kind of, it's not about you getting necessarily what you want. It's about kind of listening to what all the parties in a room want and also hearing what they're not saying, right? So there's always a subtext in negotiation. So sometimes why someone wants, X percentage of a company isn't always because they want that. There's another reason behind that, right? So I think that there's a lot of empathy, a lot of listening, a lot of in tactics. It's a lot of making sure that every single party is being heard at the table, and then figuring out like how do we create solutions around that so that everyone kind of walks away with at least part of what they wanted, right? I think any good negotiation or any good negotiator will tell you that a best solution is when everyone walks away a little bit unhappy because they've given up something. So from my side, I realized as much as I don't have an MBA, so much of my job is, back channel conversations, understanding what people want, building trust. That's a huge fundamental thing that needs to exist. And then, really kind of developing relationships so that, when you're kind of, figuring out what is it that everyone wants, how can I as an investor also make sure that my best interest is served, that I'm also listening to what the other side is saying and figuring out how we can actually reach a solution that might be more at the middle. So yeah, it's been an interesting realization that skill set has come in handy very often in this space.
Okay. Speaking of I2I ventures, what is the role and unique power of gendered capital in the MENAP region?
Sure. Yeah, so I think that, we don't only invest. So I2I Ventures, we are the first and only female founded venture capital fund in the country, right? But we don't only invest in female led companies, but we do believe that our lens being gendered is actually a big asset for us. And I think the reason for that is that oftentimes companies that might be overlooked because they might be seeming too female, right? I had a comment given to me the other day by a fellow investor in the MENA region who said, "Oh, this product is too gendered." So it was like, I don't understand it, right? Whereas from my side, I don't see anything. From my side, the biggest asset is, if you're looking at a woman first financial product, right? That's a drastically overlooked commercial opportunity that that a lot of people may not quote unquote understand, but we understand it fundamentally as women, right? So we understand that there's a need to actually uncover that. And so from my perspective, I think that if you're overlooking half of the population and products that can serve half of that population, then you are not living to the potential of what you should be as a fund. And I think that we've seen this happen, and I've seen this happen from our Accelerator program, that women-led companies actually outperform their male counterparts, right? So if we're not also including them and being inclusive and also recognizing that gender isn't binary, right? So it's not just women and men, it's also thinking about, and also the intersectionality of it, right? It's not just women and men, it's also class, it's also religion, it's also all of these things that, oftentimes we tend to have a mimicry thing as investors, that we only look at investing in things that we understand by people that we know and who look like us, right? And I think it's just, we are cutting ourselves off from so many other ideas and people and opportunities if we aren't being more open-minded and inclusive in our approaches and how we invest, and also then how we manage investments. So from our perspective, that's our approach. It's not just, only investing in female-led companies, but even if we invest in companies led by men, how can their products actually be more inclusive towards everyone? How can their hiring practices, how can their board, all of those things that I think lead to just better and more healthy companies.
Okay, so apart from seeing it from a gendered lens, how did you also leverage being part of the Pakistani diaspora?
Sure. So, I grew up in Pakistan, and so for me, I've had a very strong connection. My most formative years, I finished high school in Pakistan, and my parents were still living there. My dad still lives there right now. I've had a very strong connection there, but I think the best part about being diaspora, quote unquote, is that, you kind of straddle both worlds, right? You straddle being in the US, and then and also in other outside of Pakistan as well as being in the country. Sometimes what's good about that is it gives you a little bit of a bird's eye perspective on things when you need to give yourself space to look at a situation, but also you know how to code switch into different situations, right? So I know I can be as American as I need to be in a certain situation to get things done, and I can be more desi if I need to be, right, in a situation in South Asia or in Pakistan. And so I think the diaspora lens for me is more just about, like, first of all, the responsibility that I have as someone who's part of the diaspora, what my role as well as my what my privilege has afforded me, my education, my background. But then the second thing is that, just by virtue of being both, or being multi-hyphenated, right? I wouldn't even call myself Pakistani American, really. I only became American recently. I'm much more of a third culture kid. I've kind of grown up everywhere. That affords you the ability to kind of code switch into different situations. And I think in that way, be able to kind of drop in and understand things maybe faster than someone who is fully just American, right? Or fully just something. So I've never really seen myself as like necessarily diaspora or anything else. I think I've always just identified more as like a third culture kid that can just kind of drop in when I need to, not when I need to, drop in and know how to respond to a situation in a way that's necessary for that situation.
Understand the system more sensitively.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So you have raised funds from LPs all over the world. What are some tactical tips that you would give for emerging VCs on raising their first fund?
Right. So, I mean, I'm still raising my first fund. So I'm very much in the same boat as anyone raising that right now. And hopefully we'll be able to do that soon in terms of closing the fund. But I think the biggest thing is the learnings that I've had are, number one, figuring out your value proposition. Like, what is your unfair advantage as a fund that other funds in your market don't have, right? For us, one part of it is being a female-led fund, but a second part is that we've had a muscle that we've built for 10 years before we launched a fund, right? Of building an accelerator program, having a research team, all of those things that kind of act to our advantage. So really figure out, what is your advantage? How are you? This is the thing that number one people care about when you're speaking to LPs. What is your unfair advantage in terms of getting to the best deals, right? How are you going to get access to them that other people can't? What are you going to do after the deal is done? What's your value proposition in terms of portfolio management? Because that also then, the better you can support your portfolio, the more that they can raise future capital, but also the more value you provide, that becomes a big evangelizing tool for other founders that you speak to, right? Because they all speak to one another. So the other thing then is really figuring out, because I think, we see a lot of the same funds pitching very similarly. So figuring out that secret sauce, figuring out why you're doing it, and being able to communicate that very effectively in a way that inspires people to join you is something that's really important. And I think, having a strong strategy in place of how you're going to do things, right? I think when we started with a phased approach with the fund as a first-time fund, and we received support from the Dutch government as well as our initial LPs. And so much of that was building an initial track record, but also figuring out our voice, right? Like, who are we? And I think that now is very clear when we're pitching for our first close right now. Of who we are and what we stand for, and also what is it that we provide, what is our secret sauce. So those are things that become really important. But I would say the number one question you get asked is, why you? And why are you different from everyone else? And how are you going to get to the deals faster than other people?
So carving out a extremely important differential factor before you actually start.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's applying the same approach as an entrepreneur, like telling an entrepreneur when they're building their company, what is your unfair advantage? You have to do that as a fund as well.
Okay. So, as one of our final questions, you're considered a pioneer in women-led entrepreneurial efforts in Pakistan. Is it overwhelming, and have you ever faced imposter syndrome? If so, how did you deal with it?
I face imposter syndrome a lot, but not for... I don't know if in terms of being, I don't really love the words pioneer and leader. Like, I think at the end of the day, like, those are terms that are projected upon you. It's not terms that I personally would use for myself. I actually find it really weird when people on their LinkedIn call themselves a pioneer. But for myself, like, I think what's really important is I just believe in doing good work, right? And I believe in challenging myself and challenging our team and challenging who I work with to constantly push ourselves and ask ourselves, are we doing enough, right? And I think by virtue of being like that, we've always been, I feel, have done a really good job and continue to try to do a good job. And because we have that intention, are always like trying to push ourselves to do more. And so I've had imposter syndrome about being an investor because it's something that I don't have a traditional background in. I've definitely had imposter syndrome in so many things that I do on a daily basis, but I don't really let that hold me back. I think what I focus more on is less about it being, I think the more you focus on being less about yourself and who you are in this, like, and if I'm a pioneer or not, because I've never thought of myself that way, I'm much more focused on like, did I do a good job today? Like, have I done good work? And by virtue of measuring that, the measurement of that comes from the founders that you invest in. It comes from the founders that you accelerate, right? And if you're not providing value there, then you're not doing your job. So what I feel always have felt really proud about, and what I don't have imposter syndrome around, is that I know we've done good work, and that good work is measured by the fact that our founders have all felt that we've created value in their companies' lives. So that's why I don't feel it on that. But I mean, you feel imposter syndrome is just part of it's human nature. It's part of everything. And so the only way to counter that is just to put your head down and do good work.
And on that note, thank you so much, Kalsoom, for coming on Leading with Women.
Sure. Thank you so much.